The Sundown Close-Up. With only days left in office, a lot of people are wondering, what will President Barack Obama's legacy be? We're going to talk about what he was able to accomplish and what he wasn't. And Republicans in Washington are already in the process of repealing one of the president's signature laws. What will New Hampshire's healthcare landscape look like without the Affordable Care Act? Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Josh McKelvin. In 5 days, whether you like it, love it, or hate it, Donald Trump will be inaugurated in one of the most stunning election wins in modern history. Not to be forgotten, though, the president we've known for the last 8 years. So, how will history remember Barack Obama? Here to discuss it, two men who know the president very well and have known him since his historic win in the campaign. Former New Hampshire co-chairs Jim Demers and Ned Helms. Gentlemen, good to see you this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here. Nice to be here.
So yeah, I mean, when you're looking back over the last 8 years, and Jim, we'll start with you. What stands out most? What's your biggest memory? Is it something, a personal moment? Was it something the president did? I mean, what do you think?
Well, there are two things. I think one, from the campaign perspective, how he reinvigorated grassroots campaigning. We saw it right here in New Hampshire, where thousands of people actually volunteered for the campaign, something we hadn't seen in years. Young people got involved. We hadn't seen that kind of engagement since the Vietnam War. So that kind of stands out. And then I think, even though most people will say the health care legislation was probably his biggest accomplishment, I think it really was getting the country out of the recession that we were in, because none of the other stuff would have mattered. We were on the verge of economic collapse. I mean, the stock market was plummeting, banks were in trouble.
Sure.
And he really did lead the country out of an economic recession to where we are today, where unemployment is at unbelievable low rates. The stock market is soaring. It's quite a turnaround when you really think about it.
Ned, what do you think about when, is it a campaign moment, or is it something the president was able to accomplish?
Well, certainly the accomplishments. Having been in health policy my whole life, the Affordable Care Act is just an extraordinary achievement. I think back to some of the political stuff. Michelle Obama did her first coffee at our house, and Sally, my wife, introduced her. And it was at that moment nobody knew who Michelle Obama was, other than the fact that she was this rather extraordinary woman. And she captivated a crowd of about 100 people, and you could hear a pin drop, and she worked it through, and all of a sudden you're saying to yourself, this guy has one other asset going with him, and that's Michelle Obama.
Right.
The other thing I remember from a political point of view is on the primary night, Jim and I were down at Nashua High School, and the returns were coming in, and it was pretty clear Barack Obama wasn't going to win. And he came into that gym, and before he went on to give the speech that he did about yes, we can, he was going around sort of saying to people, don't worry about this. I've won, I've lost. And you sort of got that no drama Obama. We're going to be okay on this. And you got a sense of that sort of timber that he had, that he doesn't get ruffled, that he's calm and cool. And I think that calmness and that coolness, although some people see it as detached, has been the very quality that's allowed him to do the things that Jim talked about. Sure. To be able to persevere with the auto industry, with the recovery, all of that.
But when you talk about his calm demeanor, not getting ruffled, he also had the ability, I mean, you talk about the crowds right before we started taping, the thousands of people that would turn out. What was it about him? We're talking about a first, term senator, U.S. senator, that was able to generate so much energy. What do you think he had? Was it just the it factor? Is it that simple?
You know, what was interesting to me is that when people came out of those things, yes, they were excited about Obama, but they were also excited about what they could do. I think he was able to transfer that sense of, yes, we can accomplish this. So it wasn't just, yes, he can. He's going to lead it. It's us. And that campaign became about much more than just about Barack and Michelle Obama. It became about people themselves and what they could do if they took on the responsibilities and owned it.
Jim?
Yeah, I think, what Ned said, Barack Obama had this amazing maturity, political maturity, even though he had only been in the United States Senate for 2 years. He embraced people who actually worked against him at times. When you think about, he picked Joe Biden to be his vice president. He picked Hillary Clinton to be Secretary of State. They had campaigned against him.
Looking at a video right now of Barack Obama in 2007, I believe, and that is here in New Hampshire. Keep going, Jim. Just wanted to.
So, but he had this mature level of, I'm not going to let things that have happened in the past interfere with my mission of what I've got and what I want to do. And I think he governed that way, that he knew it was going to be tough. But he kept going back at things, and you know, when you think about it, his centerpiece issue through that entire campaign was health care reform, and he lived up to it. People may not be excited, some people, about the final outcome, but he campaigned and promised that's what he was going to do, and he followed through on it.
Sure, and while Republicans are poised to repeal the ACA, there are provisions that they agree are worth keeping. We'll see how this looks at the end, but Ted Kennedy said before he passed away, you know, Barack Obama is the one guy that can deliver universal health care. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, when we look back at large reform legislation, Medicare, Social Security, those things didn't pass and all of a sudden become perfect. There was a lot of legislation that went through afterward to modify it, to change it. What's happened since that bill has been passed in 2010, the only thing the Republicans have said is repeal it, as opposed to, you know, there's something over here that's not working, let's fix it. And so I think that what you're going to see is it will be called by them repeal it, because they have to say that first. But I think at the end of the day, and I certainly hope at the end of the day, it's more reform it, refine it, and perfect it. That's what I hope happens.
Let me ask you about his legacy, because obviously in this election, you know, Bernie Sanders' emergence, you know, kind of fractured the party a little bit. Do you believe, Ned, that Barack Obama, when we look back at him, or the Democratic Party and Democratic voters look back at him, will look at him in a vacuum and not so much with the fracture that we saw with this cycle?
I don't think that we're going to look at this cycle as a huge fracture. I think back when Ted Kennedy took on Jimmy Carter. When we had Hubert Humphrey and George McCarthy, there have been times in our party, it's a raucous party. But at the end, it's the forward movement. And I think what's going to be remembered is the extraordinary activity that Jim talked about. An auto industry about to fall into the abyss, saved. A country that is in the edge of recession to plunge into depression, saved. 30 million people with health insurance. Those are the things we'll think about. And then we'll look to the politics and say, and yet the progress still went on, and we'll see the Democratic Party do just fine as we move forward. Has
a president ever come into office, Jim, with expectations that Barack Obama had on his shoulders and the challenges that laid immediately there before? A lot of people thought, you know, this guy's magic. He can walk on water. The reality is he's a human being in a country that's facing a lot of challenges.
I mean, there's no doubt he had a meteoric rise to from where he was to become president of the United States, and the bar was set exceptionally high. But you know, the biggest challenge he faced was the day he got elected, the other party decided they weren't going to work with him on anything. And so he probably faced the biggest resistance, partisan resistance, that any president has ever seen. When you think about Mitch McConnell in those opening days after his swearing in, saying that his mission was to ensure that Barack Obama didn't win re-election. He didn't say, my mission is to work with the president to get this economy running. He didn't talk about, we need to work together on health care. He said, this is going to be partisan gridlock so that we make sure this guy doesn't win again. That was one heck of an obstacle to have to overcome. But when you think about it, even with all the poison and gridlock that we've seen over the 8 years in Washington, a lot still got done.
I'm not going to ask you guys to speak for the president, but if you had to guess, as he looks back on his tenure, if there's something that he would rather do differently or get a do-over or put more effort into, what do you think it would be now?
It's interesting to listen to him because you don't get do-overs. I think we'll probably, when he publishes a book, which I anticipate, we'll see some of his reflections about that. I've got to believe that some of the things that are going on in the Middle East, Syria, those types of things, you wish there was a magic bullet you could have pulled out at the time. But what he said is, in retrospect, as he goes back and instead of using hindsight, said, if I was there at that time with what I knew, would I have chosen differently? And what he said is, at each moment, he thinks he made the right choice, but the path was so difficult. Sure. So I think that that was the case. I think the other thing that he feels very badly about is he went down there saying, we're not red states and blue states, we're the United States. And I think one of his big disappointments was that the Republican Party chose, before his swearing in, to say, we will do nothing to assist the President of the United States, even if it's for the best of the country, because our goal is to be rid of you as quickly as possible. I think he wishes that he could have changed that attitude, but there's no magic wands.
But I also think there's one issue that pains him a lot, and that is the increasing gun violence that has occurred across the country. You know, when the speech he gave after the shooting at the school in Connecticut, and he wept, I think he probably wishes that the two parties could have come together to deal with that issue, and they didn't. And it pained him a lot personally to watch every week gun violence occurring across the country.
Sure. We only have about a minute to go, but if you guys had to identify the next leaders within the Democratic Party, what names come to mind?
Well, I think that we're going to sort of watch that as it emerges. You know, we've got Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. We've got Cory Booker from New Jersey. We've got governors out in the Midwest. We've got other people. My guess is that some of the people that will be leaders 2 and 4 years from now are not names that are on everybody's lips right now. They'll be people who quietly go about their business. I think what we're going to see is people working very hard where they are to try and get things done so they can come forward and say, here's what I've accomplished, as opposed to, here's my bumper sticker.
And I know you're a big fan of New Jersey Senator Cory Booker as well.
You know, I think that even watching how this Senate session has begun and Cory Booker has taken the leadership role in some of the confirmation hearings that are taking place. So I think, you know, Cory Booker is someone to watch. I think Elizabeth Warren is another person. But I agree with Ned. There'll be more that will come along, and my expectation is it won't be long before they start coming to New Hampshire, because this election was far from an overwhelming vote in support of Donald Trump.
Don't fill in those yard sign holes yet.
Very good. Well, we're out of time. I appreciate you guys being here, and it's got to be somewhat satisfying, maybe very satisfying, knowing that you worked on this campaign, and now we're talking about 2 terms in the White House.
Absolutely.
So congratulations to both of you. Good
Thanks,
to see you.
Josh, for having us.
Yeah, we'll be right back with more talking about the Affordable Care Act and the future of it. Stay with us.